In 1973, inside CIA headquarters, industrial shredders ran until the blades overheated. Boxes of documents were reduced to pulp. Reports vanished. Names disappeared. Entire psychological profiles dissolved into waste. The order came from CIA Director Richard Helms. The program being erased was called Project MKUltra. It was never meant to survive on paper. The origins trace back to 1953. The Cold War had transformed fear into policy. American intelligence believed hostile powers were experimenting with brainwashing. Confessions from prisoners of war during the Korean conflict intensified paranoia. The human mind was no longer a private domain. It was viewed as a battlefield. Under the authority of Allen Dulles, a covert directive was approved. Its objective was clinical and stripped of morality. Identify techniques capable of penetrating, destabilizing, and controlling human consciousness. Funding moved through academic fronts and research foundations. Laboratories received grants without knowing the origin. Psychiatrists were contracted. Private institutions participated unknowingly. The architecture of the program was deliberate, compartmentalized, deniable, silent. LSD became the primary instrument. At the time, it was unpredictable and poorly understood. Researchers observed that it could fracture perception, dissolve ego boundaries, and produce extreme suggestibility. Under MKUltra, large quantities were acquired and distributed for experimentation. Some subjects volunteered under the assumption of therapeutic study. Others were never informed. In certain operations, individuals were administered LSD without consent. In apartments wired for surveillance, in clinical settings, in controlled environments disguised as routine research. Subjects experienced severe paranoia, dissociation, and psychological collapse. Agents documented every reaction behind one-way mirrors. Emotional breakdowns were treated as data points. Identity destabilization was categorized as progress. The program expanded beyond chemical manipulation. Sensory deprivation chambers isolated subjects from light and sound for extended durations. Sleep deprivation protocols dismantled cognitive stability. Electroconvulsive procedures were applied at intensities designed to erase memory patterns. Hypnosis was tested as a tool for behavioral override. The methodology followed a brutal hypothesis: dismantle the personality structure, then reconstruct it according to directive. Some participants emerged disoriented for months. Others reported persistent anxiety, memory fragmentation, and intrusive hallucinations. Official documentation rarely followed long-term outcomes. The objective was not rehabilitation. It was operational feasibility. One internal incident destabilized the illusion of control. In 1953, CIA scientist Frank Olson was secretly administered LSD during a retreat with colleagues. Within days, his mental state deteriorated. He expressed moral concern regarding classified activities. 9 days later, he fell from the 13th floor of a New York hotel. The death was ruled a suicide. Decades later, exhumation and forensic analysis suggested physical trauma inconsistent with a voluntary fall. The full account remains obscured by missing records and destroyed memoranda. By the early 1970s, political scrutiny intensified across intelligence operations. Anticipating investigation, Helms authorized the destruction of most MKUltra archives. Thousands of files vanished. What survived did so by administrative accident. Financial records stored separately from operational documents. These fragments later surfaced during inquiries by the United States Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. The surviving material confirmed experiments conducted without informed consent, including on civilians. It revealed systematic concealment and the deliberate fragmentation of accountability. Yet the majority of operational specifics, subject identities, full methodologies, internal communications were irretrievably destroyed. MKUltra officially concluded in the 1970s. No complete archive exists. No comprehensive list of victims has ever been published. Portions of related documentation remain classified. The experiment was designed to master the human mind. Instead, It demonstrated how fear can override ethical constraint, how bureaucracy can normalize psychological harm, and how silence can be engineered through paper shredders and sealed vaults. The program was not supposed to exist. For years, it almost didn't. The surviving files revealed that MKUltra was not a single study but a network of subprojects, over 150, scattered across institutions, front organizations, and private contractors. Each carried a number instead of a name. Each reduced human beings to variables. The structure ensured deniability. No single researcher saw the entire design. No single signature carried the full weight of responsibility. Financial conduits disguised the origin of funds. Foundations were established as buffers. Grants were issued to respected universities. The academic environment provided credibility. The classification layers provided protection. The language inside internal memoranda was antiseptic, behavioral modification, resistance reduction, cognitive restructuring. The terminology concealed the violence embedded within the procedures. In certain facilities, subjects were exposed to prolonged isolation. Sensory deprivation tanks eliminated light, sound, and temporal reference. After extended confinement, cognition began to deteriorate. Hallucinations emerged. Emotional regulation fractured. Researchers recorded compliance levels and suggestibility metrics. The objective was not merely to observe breakdown but to measure the threshold at which identity could be destabilized. Electroconvulsive methods were deployed at intensities exceeding standard psychiatric practice of the era. Repetition was emphasized. Memory disruption was documented as a desirable outcome. When recollection blurred, suggestibility increased. When personal narrative fragmented, resistance weakened. The human mind was treated as circuitry. Overload it, reset it, reprogram it. Hypnosis protocols attempted layered commands. Suggestions embedded beneath surface awareness. Operatives theorized about sleeper responses triggered by coded phrases. The results were inconsistent, yet experimentation continued. Failures were filed, adjusted, and repeated. The pursuit was not guided by certainty but by obsession. Within detention environments and correctional institutions, vulnerable populations were selected for experimentation. Informed consent procedures were minimal or absent. Some individuals believed they were participating in addiction research or psychiatric therapy. Documentation rarely indicated long-term monitoring. Once immediate observation concluded, subjects were released back into ordinary life carrying destabilized perceptions and fractured trust. Parallel research examined chemical combinations, sedatives, stimulants, hallucinogens administered sequentially to evaluate control gradients. The intention was to identify a compound capable of extracting information, inducing compliance, or erasing memory traces. Reports acknowledged severe anxiety reactions, psychotic episodes, and persistent paranoia. These outcomes were classified as side effects, not endpoints. Operational memoranda emphasized urgency. The Cold War justification framed ethical hesitation as strategic weakness. If adversaries were experimenting without restraint, restraint itself was framed as vulnerability. This logic normalized escalation. Each boundary crossed created precedent for the next. When congressional scrutiny intensified during the 1970s, institutional self-preservation became priority. The destruction order eliminated the majority of operational files. Survivors of experimentation were left without comprehensive documentation to validate claims. Fragmented evidence complicated legal recourse. Silence became structural. Testimonies that emerged during later investigations described disorientation lasting years. Some individuals reported chronic anxiety, intrusive recollections, impaired memory continuity. Others recounted an enduring inability to trust institutions. The absence of complete records meant that personal narratives often stood without official corroboration. The psychological dimension of MKUltra extends beyond individual cases. It demonstrated how administrative language can sanitize coercion, how classified compartments can distribute culpability until no one appears fully accountable. The program functioned within offices, not hidden laboratories carved into mountains. It was signed, budgeted, and archived until it was shredded. Declassified fragments confirm scope but not totality. Subprojects remain partially redacted. Names are blacked out. Methodologies are incomplete. The gaps are as significant as the surviving text. MKUltra did not produce a perfected method of mind control. It produced documentation of systematic experimentation conducted under the authority of national security. It revealed the elasticity of ethical boundaries when fear is institutionalized. The absence of complete archives ensures that the full inventory of consequences is unknown. What persists is a partial record, evidence that the experiment existed, that it operated for years, and that much of it was deliberately erased. The files were destroyed. The program was terminated. The implications remain. As investigations widened, a pattern became visible. MKUltra was not an anomaly hidden in a single department. It was embedded within the institutional culture of covert competition. Psychological research, chemical testing, interrogation theory, and behavioral science converged under one directive: neutralize autonomy if necessary. Internal communications framed subjects as assets, materials, or cases. Human complexity was translated into operational metrics. Anxiety levels were scored. Resistance was quantified. Emotional breakdown was graphed over time. The language removed identity and replaced it with performance indicators. Several subprojects explored the mechanics of induced amnesia. Researchers examined whether traumatic stimuli combined with pharmacological intervention could permanently suppress memory retrieval. The hypothesis was that information could be extracted and then erased. Reports described confusion, prolonged cognitive impairment, and dissociative symptoms. The documentation did not prioritize recovery. Other branches investigated the intersection of pain and suggestion. If stress weakened critical reasoning, suggestion could enter with reduced friction. Protocols tested escalating discomfort, environmental manipulation, isolation, chemical disorientation. The assumption was linear. Destabilization precedes compliance. Financial records later revealed millions of dollars allocated over 2 decades. Adjusted for modern value, the investment reflected sustained commitment. This was not a short-term experiment. It was a prolonged institutional effort. During the mid-1960s, ethical standards in medical research began evolving publicly, yet MKUltra continued under classified exemptions. Oversight mechanisms that applied to civilian research did not penetrate intelligence compartments. The structure of secrecy functioned as insulation. In some documented cases, participants reported extended psychological disturbances years after exposure. Panic episodes, sleep disruption, persistent distrust. These outcomes rarely intersected with official acknowledgement. Without complete files, attribution remained fragmented. Individual accounts existed in isolation from a comprehensive archive. The exposure of MKUltra during Senate investigations did not deliver full clarity. The surviving financial documents indicated the scale of activity but omitted detailed methodologies for many subprojects. Congressional hearings established that non-consensual experimentation had occurred, yet the destruction of operational records prevented exhaustive reconstruction. The absence of total documentation created a paradox. Enough evidence survived to confirm systemic misconduct. Not enough remained to quantify its full reach. The result was partial accountability within incomplete visibility. MKUltra illustrates a structural phenomenon. When national security imperatives are paired with unrestricted classification authority, ethical review can become procedural rather than substantive. Authorization signatures replace moral deliberation. Compliance with secrecy becomes the dominant obligation. No confirmed evidence demonstrates that the program achieved reliable mind control. What is documented is persistent experimentation, repeated escalation, and deliberate concealment. The measurable outcome was not mastery over consciousness, but institutional willingness to test the limits of it. The destruction of files in 1973 functioned as both termination and containment. Prevented operational compromise. It also obstructed historical transparency. Surviving fragments exist because accounting procedures separated financial summaries from experimental logs. An administrative technicality preserved proof of existence. Today, portions of related materials remain classified or heavily redacted. The incomplete record ensures that MKUltra occupies a space between documented history and unresolved archive. It is not myth. It is not fully mapped. The psychological horror is not theatrical. It lies in process. Authorization memos, budget approvals, research contracts, destruction orders. Each step bureaucratically rational. Each step incrementally detached from the individuals affected. The experiment was conceived under fear, expanded under secrecy, and concluded under shredders. Its architecture demonstrates how institutions can pursue control of the mind without public mandate, without transparent oversight, and without comprehensive reckoning. What remains is a documented fact. For 2 decades, under official authorization, human consciousness was treated as an operational variable. Much of the paper trail is gone. The precedent is not. The operational culture that sustained MKUltra did not emerge in isolation. It developed within an intelligence environment that equated hesitation with strategic vulnerability. Analysts warned of adversaries exploring psychological warfare. Briefings amplified the threat. In that climate, experimental escalation could be framed as defensive necessity rather than ethical deviation. Training manuals referenced behavioral influence and resistance degradation. Field officers were instructed on chemical handling protocols. Laboratory technicians cataloged reactions with technical precision, pulse rate, speech distortion, dissociation onset. The documentation reduced destabilization to observable metrics. The suffering embedded in those metrics remained outside the report format. Certain subprojects attempted to identify compounds capable of inducing rapid compliance during interrogation. Combinations of hallucinogens and sedatives were tested to determine whether confusion could accelerate disclosure. Reports acknowledged volatility. Subjects oscillated between euphoria, terror, and incoherence. Stability was not the objective. Control was. Archival fragments indicate coordination with external specialists in psychiatry and pharmacology. Professional reputations provided scientific legitimacy. Compartmentalization ensured that few participants understood the broader application of their findings. Knowledge existed in segments, preventing comprehensive internal dissent. The institutional logic followed a progression. First, establish threat urgency. Second, authorize classified research. Third, insulate operations from public review. Fourth, measure outcomes in operational terms rather than ethical ones. The cycle normalized itself through repetition. As the 1960s progressed, public trust in government institutions began eroding due to unrelated controversies. Within intelligence circles, this external scrutiny intensified protective behavior. Record-keeping practices shifted toward greater fragmentation. Sensitive correspondence was limited to verbal briefings. Documentation density decreased as awareness of potential exposure increased. When investigative committees later examined intelligence activities, MKUltra surfaced not because it was voluntarily disclosed, but because financial ledgers contradicted official silence. Surviving budget sheets listed subproject codes and disbursement totals. The absence of corresponding research files highlighted deliberate destruction. Testimony from former officials acknowledged authorization but often minimized operational impact. Without comprehensive archives, counterclaims relied heavily on survivor accounts and partial documentation. The evidentiary imbalance favored institutional opacity. From a structural perspective, MKUltra demonstrates how secrecy frameworks can outpace ethical safeguards. Classification authority, when combined with national security rationale, can suspend ordinary accountability mechanisms. The internal review becomes self-referential. Compliance is measured against secrecy protocols, not external standards. The long-term implications extend beyond the specific substances tested. The program established a precedent. Cognitive autonomy could be subjected to covert experimentation under executive authorization. Even after termination, the conceptual boundary had been crossed. Declassified memoranda confirm that not all subprojects were fully mapped during Senate review. Some file references pointed to material already destroyed. Others indicated related initiatives under different code names. The archival gaps function as negative space, absence suggesting scale. The psychological dimension persists in historical analysis. Researchers examining MKUltra encounter incomplete datasets, redacted paragraphs, and destroyed appendices. The narrative must be reconstructed from fragments. This fragmentation mirrors the experience of subjects whose memory and perception were intentionally destabilized. No official comprehensive registry of affected individuals exists. Compensation efforts were limited and case-specific. Many participants likely never knew they had been part of a classified experiment. Their reactions were absorbed into ordinary life without formal acknowledgement. Institutionally, MKUltra ended. Procedurally, guidelines for human subject research strengthened across federal agencies in subsequent decades. However, the historical episode remains an instructive case study in the interaction between fear, secrecy, and administrative power. The files that survived provide confirmation. The files that were destroyed ensure incompleteness. Together, they form a documented but partially obscured record of sustained experimentation on human cognition. The experiment did not achieve reliable mind control. It did achieve proof that, under certain conditions, institutional systems can prioritize strategic ambition over individual autonomy with minimal internal resistance. The shredders stopped in 1973. The documentation ended there. The historical record did not. In the aftermath of exposure, internal reforms were announced, procedural adjustments drafted, and oversight frameworks publicly reinforced. Yet reform language did not reconstruct the erased archive. The absence of primary documentation limited external evaluation of scope, intensity, and full methodological range. What remained was confirmation of intent and partial confirmation of execution. Analysts reviewing the surviving fragments noted consistent patterns. Experimental volatility accepted as operational cost, limited documentation of aftercare, and persistent reliance on classification to restrict scrutiny. The program's duration, approximately 2 decades, indicated institutional continuity across administrative transitions. Authorization persisted beyond individual leadership. The Cold War context provided strategic justification, but it also functioned as psychological reinforcement within the agency. Competitive threat narratives amplified risk tolerance. The belief that adversaries might disregard ethical constraints created a feedback loop. Perceived external amorality rationalized internal compromise. In several subprojects, researchers evaluated the durability of implanted suggestion following pharmacological disruption. Follow-up intervals varied. Some reports referenced behavioral compliance lasting hours or days. None demonstrated stable, programmable control. Despite inconsistent results, funding cycles continued. Operational ambition outweighed empirical limitation. The destruction order in 1973 represented a decisive administrative act. It converted a controversial operational history into an incomplete historical puzzle. Without comprehensive files, institutional exposure narrowed to what accidental preservation allowed. This act shifted MKUltra from fully documentable program to partially reconstructed case study. For historians and legal analysts, the episode underscores structural vulnerabilities in oversight design. When record destruction is authorized before independent review, accountability becomes contingent on archival survival rather than operational conduct. Transparency depends on preservation. Preservation depends on discretionary power. The psychological implications extend beyond direct subjects. Public awareness of MKUltra altered perception of intelligence authority. Trust, once presumed, required renegotiation. The revelation that experimentation had occurred without consent disrupted assumptions about protective governance. Scholars analyzing intelligence ethics frequently reference MKUltra as a boundary case in executive overreach. It illustrates how classification can obscure harm while simultaneously embedding it within procedural normality. Authorization memos, budget approvals, and compartmented reporting created an administrative shield that insulated decision-makers from immediate consequence. Even with declassification efforts over subsequent decades, portions of related material remain withheld or heavily redacted under national security exemptions. The incomplete record ensures that quantitative assessment of total participants and precise methodologies cannot be finalized with certainty. The uncertainty itself is a residual effect of deliberate destruction. Operationally, MKUltra did not yield a definitive technique for controlling human will. Structurally, it demonstrated that institutional momentum can sustain ethically destabilizing programs when external oversight is minimal and internal dissent fragmented. The combination of urgency, secrecy, and bureaucratic compartmentalization proved sufficient to override conventional safeguards. The episode also reshaped research governance across federal systems. Institutional review boards and informed consent protocols gained sharper legal definition in the years following exposure. These reforms were reactive, constructed after revelation rather than before authorization. MKUltra remains a documented intelligence program with verified subprojects, confirmed non-consensual experimentation, and partially erased archives. It occupies a precise place in historical analysis. Not speculative conspiracy, not complete disclosure, but authenticated activity constrained by missing evidence. The shredding of files closed operational continuity. It did not eliminate historical consequence. The archival void ensures ongoing examination, not through complete transparency but through surviving fragments and corroborated testimony. The experiment was conceived under strategic anxiety, implemented through compartmentalized authority, and terminated through document destruction. Its legacy persists as a structural case study in how institutions can pursue cognitive manipulation within classified parameters while limiting post-factum accountability. The majority of the paper trail no longer exists. The confirmation that it once did is enough to define its place in record, and the gaps left behind remain part of the evidence. What remains of MKUltra today exists in shadows. The surviving documents are fragmented spreadsheets, cryptic memos, and partial experiment logs. They hint at the scale, but the scale itself remains unknowable. Each fragment suggests layers of activity, a network of subprojects that intersected across universities, hospitals, private labs, and front organizations. Yet for every record that survived, countless others were incinerated or shredded, their existence erased from the institutional memory. Even within the surviving fragments, the human cost is clear. Volunteers who were informed often experienced extreme disorientation, persistent anxiety, and intrusive hallucinations. Those dosed without consent, bar patrons, patients, prisoners, suffered in ways that no report could fully quantify. Lives were destabilized, identities fractured. No follow-up studies recorded long-term consequences for most subjects, leaving many to navigate the aftermath alone. The psychological horror extended far beyond laboratory walls. MKUltra's reach extended into areas once thought private. Sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, and prolonged pharmacological exposure were tested to their limits. Individuals were stripped of temporal and spatial orientation, sometimes for days. Memory fragmentation became a measure of success. Obedience under altered perception was a goal. Consent was irrelevant. Ethical boundaries were suspended under the justification of national security. Hypnosis and suggestion techniques were layered atop chemical intervention. The theory was that humans could be conditioned like machines, fractured, then reprogrammed. Yet the results were inconsistent. Some subjects collapsed entirely. Others resisted even after extreme manipulation. The data collected was treated clinically, as if the emotional devastation itself were a neutral variable. Funding streams, routed through multiple layers of bureaucratic and academic conduits, masked the source and purpose of the experiments. Universities conducted studies without awareness of the true funding authority. Hospitals ran trials that were ostensibly medical but were, in reality, operational. Private contractors were instructed to document reactions with precision while remaining blind to the larger objective. Compartmentalization ensured that no single individual could reconstruct the full network. Even within the CIA, knowledge was segmented. Analysts, field officers, and medical personnel often understood only isolated pieces of the program. Few connected operational methodology to overarching purpose. This systemic segmentation insulated leadership while distributing culpability. The bureaucracy itself became a shield, normalizing extreme procedures within the veneer of research legitimacy. As the 1960s progressed, political oversight began to intensify. External pressures, combined with internal concern over exposure, drove increased secrecy. Sensitive communication shifted to verbal briefings. Documentation was further fragmented. By the early 1970s, the program had become a series of compartmented experiments, each insulated from scrutiny. When destruction orders arrived in 1973, they completed the transformation from active program to partially erased historical event. Thousands of files vanished. Only surviving financial records and stray documents escaped the shredders. These remnants later revealed proof of activity but failed to capture full methodology or participant impact. This partial survival created an enduring ambiguity. MKUltra could be proven to exist, but the breadth and depth of human consequences remained concealed. Even now, decades later, MKUltra's legacy persists. Its psychological imprint, the precedent of non-consensual experimentation, and the structural mechanisms that allowed it to operate remain subjects of study. Scholars and historians reconstruct its activity from fragments, yet the gaps themselves convey as much about the program as the documents. Institutional fear, bureaucratic compartmentalization, and administrative authority coalesced into a system capable of destabilizing minds without accountability. MKUltra's participants, the unwitting and the voluntary alike, carried invisible scars. Disorientation, anxiety, paranoia, and fractured identity were common. For many, the effects were lifelong. For others, the absence of acknowledgement compounded trauma. The program functioned as a psychological test not just of individuals but of governance itself. How far an institution could go when secrecy, fear, and authority intersected. The shredders stopped. The documents vanished. But the experiment, and the evidence of its consequences, remains etched into history. Fragmented, incomplete, and partially concealed, it stands as a testament to human vulnerability under institutional control. The program was never supposed to exist, and yet it did. The minds it touched, the records it destroyed, and the bureaucratic mechanisms it employed ensure that MKUltra's shadow extends far beyond the years it was active. It is not fully knowable. It is not fully narratable. It is a silent warning about what can occur when power, fear, and secrecy converge, and when the human mind becomes an instrument for experimentation. The reach of MKUltra extended far beyond any single experiment or institution. It was a network of covert operations spanning cities, states, and even countries, with subprojects designed to test every conceivable method of psychological manipulation. Laboratories measured the minutiae of human reaction: eye movement, heart rate, pupil dilation, and speech patterns. Every twitch, every hesitation, every slip of memory became data to be logged, analyzed, and cataloged. Subjects of MKUltra included civilians, prisoners, patients, and sometimes agency personnel themselves. Many were unaware of their participation. Drinks were laced, apartments surveilled, hospital procedures altered, all without consent. Those who experienced the experiments often reported long-lasting mental disturbances: insomnia, paranoia, flashbacks, fragmented memory, and deep, persistent anxiety. Some never fully recovered. They returned to ordinary life carrying invisible scars, a psychological residue that no amount of official denial could erase. The program was not limited to chemical manipulation. Sensory deprivation chambers confined individuals in total darkness and silence for days. Sleep deprivation pushed subjects to cognitive collapse. Electroconvulsive procedures, administered in experimental sequences, aimed to erase memory and reshape personality. Hypnosis was layered atop these techniques, as operatives attempted to instill suggestibility deep enough to override free will. Some methods produced immediate breakdowns. Others created long-term psychological instability. Each reaction was treated as a measurable variable, a step toward an idealized model of controllable human behavior. Funding and documentation were carefully obscured. Financial records flowed through multiple layers of intermediaries, giving the appearance of legitimate academic and medical research. Universities, hospitals, and private research foundations received grants without full knowledge of their purpose. Researchers conducted experiments in good faith, unaware they were contributing to a top-secret intelligence operation. This compartmentalization ensured plausible deniability and shielded higher authorities from scrutiny. The destruction of files in 1973 was both deliberate and symbolic. Thousands of operational documents, experimental reports, and participant records were shredded or incinerated. Only partial financial and administrative records survived, inadvertently preserving evidence of the program's existence. These fragments later allowed congressional investigations to confirm MKUltra's scope, but the majority of detailed methodology, participant identities, and outcomes were permanently erased. The act of destruction itself reinforced the secrecy that had allowed MKUltra to operate unchecked for decades. The psychological horror of MKUltra extends beyond its immediate victims. It demonstrates how institutions can systematically override ethical constraints when secrecy, fear, and authority converge. Human minds were treated as instruments, subjects as materials. Administrative procedures, budget approvals, and compartmented communication replaced moral deliberation. Obedience to bureaucratic hierarchy became more important than the welfare of the individuals under study. Even decades later, MKUltra's shadow persists. Portions of files remain classified or heavily redacted. Scholars and historians reconstruct its history through fragments, testimony, and surviving financial records, but the full extent remains unknowable. The legacy is a testament to institutional power and human vulnerability, the capacity of a secretive bureaucracy to exploit fear and circumvent accountability for decades. MKUltra did not create flawless mind control. It produced something perhaps more chilling, proof that an institution could systematically experiment on human consciousness, leave many permanently altered, and erase almost all evidence of its existence. The experiment itself and the destruction of the records became part of the method, ensuring that the full scale of what was done could never be fully known. The experiment ended, the shredders cooled, and official acknowledgement remained minimal. But the memories, the psychological fallout, and the partial records preserved a haunting reality. MKUltra had existed. Its methods, its reach, and its ambition were never fully revealed. The program was never meant to be known, yet it left traces impossible to erase completely. The program was not just a secret project. It was a demonstration of the lengths to which fear and authority can bend morality, a warning etched into history. It was an experiment that should never have existed. And yet it did. The minds it touched, the documents it destroyed, and the shadows it cast remain. They are the silent evidence of a systematic attempt to dominate the human psyche, a reminder that even when erased, such darkness leaves an imprint. The shredders are silent now. The documents are gone. The experiments officially ended decades ago. Yet MKUltra's legacy remains. Fragmented records, haunted testimonies, and the unsettling realization that an institution once sought to control human minds without consent. The program never achieved perfect mind control, but it achieved something more profound and terrifying. Proof that fear, secrecy, and authority can override morality, leaving countless lives altered and nearly all evidence erased. History remembers in fragments. Survivors carry the invisible scars, and the shadow of MKUltra serves as a warning. Some experiments are too dark to exist, yet some darkness always finds a way to leave its mark. The experiment was never supposed to exist, and yet it did, and its echoes still linger.